Thank you very much, Jerome, and thank you to the Ronald Center for the invitation and the warm welcome that I've had so far. And thank you all for being here. It's really I feel that the opportunity that's afforded by giving a presentation or more than one presentation here is offering me a lot of insight and a lot of benefit and furthering reflection about the subject matter of my book. And it's always good to think more deeply about works that one is working on. And the appearance of a book should not mean that the subject matter itself is closed. And I've been pursuing my research into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission since the appearance of the book and as the commission continues its work. First of all, a bit of an explanation about the change of the subject matter and what I plan to do. I've given 2 talks on the subject matter here already, yesterday and today. And I thought, all right, enough. Let's do something a little bit different. Not recycle the same thing that I've presented, but touch on the same theme. So I did what I probably shouldn't do. Tinkered with my talk last minute this afternoon. And I'll be presenting something just a little bit different from what I've done in the past few days. I want to begin by talking briefly about my engagement in the TRC, which came to my attention through the work of the commission, yes, but the entree into investigating the TRC came from an awareness that I had through a research assistant that the Oblates had a different perspective on the TRC, and that was a starting point to interviewing the priests and brothers and nuns of the Oblate order about their very different take on the commission. As soon as the commission began its work, I started participating in, attending, taking notes on, having research assistants with me, doing sort of a team approach to ethnography, anthropological research in the commission events, those that I was able to attend. I attended personally 6 of them. The exception was Vancouver, and there I watched the proceedings online, which was, I felt, actually important to do as well, provide another vantage point. And I also interviewed the people who weren't there. That included people who didn't feel that they were qualified to give testimony. It included the clergy who didn't feel that they could or didn't want to attend the commission events. So the project became a study of that phenomenon too, the boundaries and exclusions of the commission. What emerged out of this was a consideration of the TRC as a distinct institutional phenomenon. It was defined in large measure by its mandate. It was defined by the scope of its powers. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit further. First, a little bit of a plug for the book, because I like the cover very much, and I'll have occasion to talk about the work of art that is a part of that book. What I want to do that's a little bit different from my earlier talks today is talk about emotions and the law. Because often what we think about in terms of legal phenomenon is something that is dispassionate. We think of bureaucracies as dispassionate. The TRC is a bureaucracy, it's a legal phenomenon, and it's anything but dispassionate. And what I find in terms of the emotion that permeates the TRC is, yes, it's sorrow, it's regret, it's anger, but as a judicial phenomenon, what I see as an emotion associated with the law is indignation, the emotional equivalent, the emotional counterpoint to a sense of injustice. And I'll talk a little bit further, a little bit further about this. Just in this citation that I have here is one of the very few literary evocations of this sense of injustice, even though injustice motivates a lot of the Hollywood scripts that we see and consume all the time. It's about somebody seeking justice, right? The themes of what motivates people to action. And here we have Jakob Wasserman in the Mauritius case. Not a particularly great book, but in this passage describing the sense of suffocation that occurs in the encounter, the personal encounter with a wrongful conviction. It going right through me, hurting body and soul, as though somebody had filled my mouth full of sand and I had to choke on the spot. This is the kind of thing that people experience. And yet it isn't something that prevents them from action, as anger does, that paralyzes one with the intensity. It allows, indignation allows people to strategize. You can think about that sense of injustice. You can plan around it. And it's a phenomenon that I see occurring in many forms in the TRC and its work. Now, first of all, some key facts of the TRC as an institution, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. Roughly in operation for around 100 years. The number of schools in operation during this time is approximately 140. There are some 150,000 students through the history of the schools who went through the system, 86,000 of whom are alive today. The compensation regimes that are associated with the Indian Residential School Settlement Act make it the largest restitution agreement in Canadian history as an outcome of litigation. For those who were able to indicate through some evidence that they had attended school, there is a regime of compensation known as the Common Experience Payment. It is in the amount now of $16 billion, or more than. I have the 16 billion, and the estimated cost of those settlements that went through the independent assessment process, in which people could bring some evidence of harm through an adjudicator. The cost of that process is now at $3.5 billion and counting. So it's a massive settlement agreement, a part of which includes, as I'll talk about in the next slide, the TRC itself and its mandate. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is different from other TRCs in some key respects. It is not transitional justice in the sense that there is a fundamental change in the direction of government. There is no end of a civil war, a change of regime. There is no fundamental constitutional reform that is taking place at the origins of it. It's an outcome of litigation. And so it isn't part of a widely recognized conflict. It's not something that everybody knows about. In South Africa, any adult who is participating or watching the work of the Truth Commission in the 1990s knew about the phenomenon of apartheid. In Guatemala, everybody knew about the history of the Civil War and what it had done. The facts, the basic facts that are at the foundation of the Truth Commission are known by everyone. In Canada, the facts at the foundation of the Truth Commission are known by few. And part of the work of the Truth Commission, as I'll get to, involves making those facts and that history known. So at the outset, part of what it is doing that is different from other TRCs is information sharing, education, outreach for a public audience that is uninformed, that doesn't know about this history. It's almost exclusively about harm to children, which is different from other TRCs. The length of time between the experience of institutionalized harm at the hands of the state, and the narration of it is greater than in any other truth commission. And that narration is associated with trauma, as I'll talk to it a little bit more fully as well. It's about the lasting experiences of childhood events, of violence, in a variety of forms, and how that has consequences for an individual's life and of the lives of families between generations. Its mandate, as I'll get to now, is something that excludes judicial authority. The mandate is probably weaker in terms of judicial authority than just about any truth commission I can think of. So it is not allowed to hold formal hearings. It's not conceived of as a public inquiry. It's not a formal legal process. What is more, it does not have subpoena powers. It can't call upon people to give testimony. It cannot compel attendance. All attendance in commission events is voluntary. It carefully defines the schools as those that were run by the federal government. And that includes some 140 schools. But those that were run by provinces, those that were run by the churches, those experiences that people had that were similar in day schools, and extending further into orphanages, into schools for the deaf, into all kinds of other institutions in which children were incarcerated, those are excluded from the mandate of the commission. In some cases, in a way that people feel is unjust, and in the way that the TRC itself sort of rankles against, and includes the Métis, who, because they were not status Indians, are not seen as attending schools that were run by the federal government. They were not considered Indian boarding schools in that sense. Even further, there is no process by which perpetrators of harm can be identified as individuals. So those who are giving their testimony, those who are providing statements, are not allowed to name names. Most truth commissions have to deal with the conundrum of the names that are provided to them. Do they press criminal charges? How do they pursue these? What does it do to follow up? How does it make those names known? Is it included in a report? I think it's in Sierra Leone that the names were published. And people were so thrilled at the publication of these names, they printed them up and carried them around in their wallets. But there is no such conundrum in Canada's Truth Commission, because the names will never appear, simply because they are not allowed to be said in the commission itself during its proceedings. And people are reminded of this fact before they do their participation in sharing statements. And this has an impact on what the commission is able to do and how it is oriented. It is more than any other truth commission that I can think of victim-centric. It is oriented towards the affirmation of survivor experience. Right, here's the conclusion on the recommendation regarding misconduct. It cannot report on such findings unless they're already established through legal proceedings. The Truth Commission is therefore oriented towards survivor testimony in a way that emphasizes survivor experience. And it does this in some instances symbolically. Here, in the image that I show here, and in the image that's part of it is on the cover of the book, we have the commission, the commission's Bentwood box. It's a carved, curved box done by the Coast Salish artist Luke Marsden, which in the front panel depicts his grandmother in the sort of style of the Northwest Coast art, who, as she reported to him when he was a child before she died, she reported being pushed down a flight of stairs and having her fingers broken. And he always wondered how that happened. They were never healed properly. And so he depicted that in the bent fingers on the box and depicted her sorrow. And this is the image that goes with the Truth Commission everywhere it goes. There's also, in another aspect of the affirmation of the Commission, is the spiritual, religious, Aboriginal tradition, the reaffirmation of traditions through the ceremonies of the Commission itself. So we have at the base of the box some pieces of sage that you can see. We have the drum that is associated with the entrance ceremonies of the Commission as it proceeded with its work. I think this photograph taken in Saskatoon. And it's also more than a lot of public, more than, well, like many commissions, it's a public event. It's a newsworthy event. And here we have a scrum of photographers at the opening ceremonies. So it isn't just a phenomenon that includes the commission and the survivors, the participants in the commission, and the audience. The audience goes much further. It includes those who are consuming the information that's presented by the media, that's consuming the information presented by the commission as it goes about its work. And the reason that a lot of people participate in the commission seems to be a sense of their impact upon the legacy of the schools, how the schools are remembered. In one event in Halifax that was actually something that occurred in other venues called How to Share Your Truth. People were told about the process of bearing witness, of sharing their statements. And they were asked about what they thought was the purpose in doing so. I didn't pose the question, others did it for me. And I recorded these replies, and this one struck me as particularly salient. We're talking about our experience in order for Canadian mainstream society to really understand where we've been, what's happened to us, so that future generations will know exactly how we were treated and why, so that it doesn't happen anymore. So they're talking not just to other Aboriginal people, not just to people attending the commission, but they see themselves, or at least this witness does, this survivor, sees themselves as addressing a futurity, addressing Canadians who might not understand the commission in the future and want to know, they want them to know about their experience, to share it with them, so that it doesn't happen anymore. And this is what it looks like. At least one image of it. This was in Inuvik. It's not the crowded room that we saw in Edmonton where there were, I don't know how many, some 500 or 800 people in the conference center. In Inuvik it was a little more laid back, and by the third day some of the chairs were empty, but there is something that continues there. We have the commissioner, whom you can see on the far right at his table. We have the survivor, who you can see on the far left at her table, and her support person. Many people, most people will go with somebody who's a family member or a friend. We have people who are a little bit listening with half an ear, and there's the jumbo screen. There were actually 2 of them in the room and 3 on the outside of the high school in which the commission's proceedings took place, and a live broadcast to an internet feed, which is acknowledged by people who are the master of ceremonies, and sometimes reported to people as we're on the internet now. We have, in Halifax it was reported, we have 4,000 people who are watching, 4,000 IP addresses, which for a TRC, by the way, is very few. giving testimony, bearing witness, sharing statements to this kind of audience is an emotional phenomenon. What we often see in people who come before the podium, probably more often than not, is deep, deep emotion that's associated with this revival of memories. It's a part of the phenomenon of going before the microphone that people acknowledge. It isn't even just people who've been traumatized by their experience in the schools and who are reporting on that experience. I remember the testimony of a Presbyterian clergyman who was part of a school in British Columbia in his 20s and gave his testimony and reported on that experience, unusually so. And by the end of it, he described himself as dazed, walking through rooms, unable to catch his breath, having to lie down, going to a room designed for the purpose in order to have sage burnt and eagle feathers waved on him, talking on the phone to family. And it took a couple of hours for him to come back from that. And people listening too were deeply moved by the experience, and I'll show you more images of this. But when people give testimony, a part of the stress, I think, comes from the cameras that are on them, from the attention. This is a major event in their lives, reporting on a traumatic experience, and they're not used to it. So we can see that these are difficult statements for people to give and for the audience members to listen to. I call this the observer observed because she saw me with my camera. The emotion is still there. This is in Saskatoon. You can see that the reports of the testimony of child abuse, of rape that occurs in the school, the predominant testimony of the commissioners sharing something that people find deeply troubling, deeply moving, including those that are there as support people. Giving testimony or bearing witness or sharing online is also part of the phenomenon, a part of the way that the information and the experience of the narration is consumed. And in Iqaluit we have, well, in every one of the events, there's a box of tissues that's put on every fourth or fifth chair. The trees that are harvested for these events must be phenomenal. You can see that one of the volunteers are also mental health volunteers. They're on the lookout for people who are sort of emotionally overwrought in the audience and can then be sort of taken care of. He looks like he has several kilos of those tissues that are in the bag. And those are destined for, in some cases, for the sacred fire that is lit at the beginning of every commission event and part of the ceremonies that take place. And the survivor testimony is also memorialized. This was something that the psychiatrists that I presented this information to were surprised at. Because not only is giving testimony one of the most unusual and important events in people's lives, it is made permanent in something that they take away with them. So from the point of view of whatever trauma they might be experiencing, it's made a permanent part of their understanding of themselves in some cases. As you can see from this table, a number of people leave them behind. They don't bother picking them up. But for those who do, it memorializes their testimony personally and makes it an essential part of the self. And what the narrations do, what the limited mandate of the commission does, is lead to a focus on the focus tends to have a number of patterns that I refer to as templates and exclusions. There are a couple of patterns that I've seen in all of the 7 commission events that occur over and over again. For the survivors who give testimony in the commissioner's sharing circle, and I have no insight into the testimony that people are giving privately, which they can also do. But in the commissioner's sharing circle, the testimony, the focus tends to be on the worst possible abuses that could take place by people under the care of those who violate their responsibility for them in very fundamental and criminal ways. The harms that they experience are unspeakable in many instances. And the stories of child rape and torture occur again and again. It becomes a prominent part of what occurs. The experience of loss occurs again and again. The loss of language, of displacement, of loneliness, again and again. And these narratives are encouraged by the Commission in the presentation of film clips that show testimony that's given before the proceedings actually begin. In some cases in which the filmed testimony that occurs in communities is edited together in a, I guess we could call it a highlight reel, so that it becomes possible for people to see how testimony was given, and also to indirectly to hear the dominant themes and narrations of the testimony. This is what I refer to as a template. Another template is that of the apology. We have church officials, usually very high ranking, who come to the commission and talk about their regret at what has happened and how it diverted from the church's opinion or understanding of what they were doing, perhaps, but more importantly, that this contrition extends into the present and in their intention to do whatever they can to overcome the harms of the past through their present behavior. So this is another pattern that we hear again and again, which is sometimes trespassed upon. It's true. The 2 occasions that I saw in particular, one was a bishop in Nuvik who gave his statement that corresponded perfectly with the pattern of contrition and of what the church was doing. But then he was called upon this second day to give testimony again. He wasn't in the room. Somebody had to go and find him. He came back. He hadn't prepared a statement, and he was asked by the commissioner. Of course, his attendance is voluntary, but what's he going to say? He was asked by the commissioner to please give another statement, and he didn't have anything prepared. So he duly went before the camera, and before the microphone, before the audience, and he talked about his own experience of being alienated by the process, how he was sworn at by people, how he could no longer wear his collar in public. And he said that we're suffering too. This was something that was totally unexpected by those who were listening. But his statement was politely accepted, if unenthusiastically. Another occasion was in Victoria, British Columbia, where a brother of the Oblate order, Brother Kavanaugh, appeared before the commission in front of hundreds of people, a huge audience for a regional event, and talked about his experience in his school as a young man. Talked about the voluntarism that was there in the setting up of the school, the community involvement, in the operation of the school, that parents were involved, people from the community participated. He talked about it as a place that was full of love in his memory. He talked about it as his truth. And in response to the narration, where he In particular, where he touched on the idea of the engagement of the community in the foundations of the school, the audience became much more than restless. They began to shout at him, "Tell the truth, tell the truth." And somebody in the back, further back, started wailing, like loudly, a kind of noise that I've never heard before. The Commissioner, Sinclair, called on health workers to intervene. And he also called on the audience to please give the brother an opportunity to finish his statement, which he duly did. And I've heard Commissioner Sinclair being given credit for doing so, and perhaps he should be. But at the same time, the audience reaction to the narrative that departed from the template, that talked about the schools in a completely different way, based upon the brother's experience of his memory and his truth, indicated somehow, the emotional reaction indicated that he crossed a boundary with the audience, that he said something that at a very profound level that they didn't want to hear, that was a source of tremendous discomfort, and in at least the case of one individual, of traumatization. And so what is left in the Commission's work is the affirmation of a particular kind of experience. And one aspect of that affirmation of that experience is the issue of genocide. That it is seen as, the schools are being seen by survivors as a genocidal event. No different from the extermination of the Jews, as this person put it. This is a theme that is a part of the understanding, and in some cases, in this case, the self-understanding of the survivor in his participation in the Commission events. So, to back up a little bit, I mentioned that one of the aspects of the TRC that's slightly unusual is the extent to which trauma is a part of the Commission's proceedings and of what it does. And Martha Minow, in her comparative study of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, talks about this trauma and talks about the idea of it being therapeutic in a national sense, not just in an individual sense. There's an idea of healing that goes with truth commissions that is supposed to happen on a variety of levels, including for the entire society. So for individuals and for the society, common understanding is that bearing witness in some sense is understood to be cathartic. It will help people through their trauma. And I'm suggesting that the focus on the victim centrism, the affirmation that takes place, might indeed at some level create a comfort zone for people to attend the commission and present their testimony. But that experience cannot be guaranteed as cathartic or as healing, and in some cases is described as re-traumatizing. People have different experiences, but overall, there is an awareness, and should be an awareness, that this kind of testimony should not be taken lightly in terms of its lasting consequences for the individuals who undertake it. And I want to challenge this idea that truth commissions, in which people bear witness and talk about traumatic experience, are necessarily therapeutic for those individuals in any kind of lasting way. The commission itself was aware of this when it began its work. This comes from the Indian Residential School Secretariat, which I looked at in August 2009. And the idea of triggering as a consequence of giving testimony was recognized then, described as the suffering of trauma caused by remembering or reliving past abuse. And we see this in people who are giving testimony. They're sometimes shaking violently, not because of the nerves of standing before the audience, but because of the experiences of reliving what they went through the narration of it. And above all, the narration in emotionally heightened circumstances, in front of the cameras, and the internet feed, and the large audience, and the jumbo screens. Right? So, triggering is something that the TRC is aware of, and they have their volunteers scouting the audience to look for those kinds of reactions. They can happen anywhere, at any place. In one instance, it happened to a person when they were visiting the learning place, what's referred to as the learning place in each one of the commission events, where there are film clips and photographic displays. He saw a woman walking by with a clipboard, and it reminded him of a nun that he'd had abused him in the school. And acts of violence were associated in his mind with the clipboard. And he lost it, as people say. And again, it was that instant in which the memory came flooding back and was momentarily paralyzing, debilitating. What are the long-term consequences of this experience? We don't know. I don't think the mental health experts who are part of the commission are necessarily secure in being able to assert that the process is healing in a systemic way. And this is reinforced by the psychiatric literature on Indian, or the literature from the Indian Residential Schools Adjudication Secretariat. Thinking about past abuse can trigger suffering and problems in the present. So people who are participating are asked to have safety measures in place. Safety, it's a danger, a risk. Just imagine something that is a mental health risk of this kind of imminence. So you have to have a support person. In some cases, in the survivor support groups, recommending carrying a comfort object, a blanket or a teddy bear or something that people can sort of refer to and regain their composure. And in the literature, post-traumatic stress, remembering trauma feels like reliving it. People are going through the experience again. Traumatic events are recalled with such vividness and emotional intensity, it seems as though the trauma were happening all over again. On one occasion, I saw a woman, I think it was in Halifax, who was giving testimony, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably on top of the table like this. She couldn't keep them under control and was aware that the audience, there's this vast audience out there looking at her, so she put her hands under the table like this. And from somewhere in the back, from this kind of angle, the camera zoomed in on her hands as they were shaking. So as she was speaking, her trembling hands were up on the screen instead of her face, the usual representation of the witnesses as they're giving testimony. So that the trauma itself becomes a part of the testimony itself, a part of the record, a part of what is presented, a part of the evidence, a part of what constitutes the memory of Indian residential schools. And yet the aftermath, what is it that the TRC left people with? In historical terms, in the sort of broad sweep of mental health intervention, it might be remembered that the Truth Commission occurred at the same time that the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was dismantled, and that psychiatric services for Aboriginal people were recalibrated. So a major policy shift at the time that this was taking place, with the interruptions that can be expected from such a thing. So the experience of people, particularly in northern communities where there are very limited resources for psychiatric intervention, the experience of the TRC coming through and doing its work led to an incredible burden of mental health interventions and inability of the local agencies to keep up with the workload. So it re-traumatized. People were told there were facilities where survivors could go and get aftercare, but people applied and were turned away because there were not the resources to take care of it. So there was a re-traumatization that occurred through the narration of experience and the listening of experience, and people going back and falling into conditions of poor mental health in a variety of forms. The commissioners themselves recognize that there are exclusions that are taking place too. So I talked about the templates and I talked about survivor experience, but in terms of the commission and its work, something that Wilton Littlechild has noticed is that the federal government is not participating. It's not, this is not a template, this is an exclusion. Because it is victim-centric, because it is voluntary, the federal government has no obligation to send anyone to any of the commission events at all. Now, it will usually send a minister to the opening ceremonies. It will make a statement at the beginning. And in some occasions, then usually get on a plane or make apologies. I don't know of any TRC in which a government official or a federal official in particular stayed through the entire event. Usually it would have just been one part of the event in the beginning, if that. And not only that, but the government and the churches as institutions are not providing the kind of access to archives. And this is what that they're expected to under the settlement agreement. And this is what Wilton Littlechild is referring to. He sees that it's an Aboriginal issue when only the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs is sent there to the opening ceremonies of the commissions. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs is not somebody who has experience as a federal official in the Indian residential schools. So if that's the only official from the federal government that is going there, then that entity that is seen by the Supreme Court in R.V. Plint as being 70% responsible for the operation and liability of the schools is almost entirely absent from the commission in terms of providing information and reporting on experience. And it doesn't have to be an official who is responsible for implementation of the schools in a formal sort of way, for the financing, for the oversight. It can be people who are school counselors. Those were federal officials too. Fire marshals, anybody who was a federal employee who had anything to do with the schools, and the roles are numerous, could have reported on what they saw, and they reported on them in an informed way and provide some sort of variety into the background of the schools. But in the form in which people sign up for giving testimony to the commissioner's sharing circle, the category of government official, checking the boxes, doesn't even exist. So a school principal reported that he had kept records and that he turned them over to the government, and now they're gone, they disappeared. The records are not there, they're not being provided as a part of the narrative of the state. Oh, sorry about the doubling up of the images. This slide shows the Anglican church display in which depicts, this is what I get for throwing together a slideshow in the afternoon before I give a talk. Depicts the middle panel, a group of girls who are shown with fresh loaves of baked bread standing on ice skates in the middle of a frozen lake. We have a hockey team. We have a boy shooting a bow. We have two kids at the bottom. You can see that more clearly with a couple of fish. So we have all of these positive images of the schools that are a part of the photographic display. These are not, with the exception of Brother Kavanaugh, these are not ideas or images or memories that I heard in the commission. Only in interviews with the Oblate priests and brothers and nuns did they talk about that kind of experience and talk about why they weren't there at the commission. They didn't feel secure, and they felt that the compensation regime had in some way injured them, that they were all being painted with the same brush, that they were seen as being perpetrators, that their life's work was poorly understood. So what we have in the base of the experience at the foundation of the commission and its work is two diametrically opposed conceptions of experience with the schools. Those who were participants as members of the church in the running of the schools on a day-to-day basis. Those who are the students. Those who are now included in the category of survivors. And so what this has done, through the weak mandate of the commission, through the encouragement, through the affirmation of survivor experience, through the voluntary exclusion of the clergy, through the intentional non-participation of the federal government, what this has done is created conditions of insecurity to unwanted narratives, to narratives that don't quite fit the template, even though the commissioners might be asking for them at various points in commission events. We want to hear positive stories. Those don't happen when there is a focus on the narration of harm. So it contradicts or challenges the dominant themes of history and experience, of cultural genocide, systemic childhood trauma, and intergenerational consequences of multifaceted oppression. So what is wrong with that? The Commission has two basic goals that it has set itself, given its weak mandate, again, going back to that, not being a judicial inquiry. It is, first of all, sees itself as providing conditions of affirmation for the gathering of statements from survivors, above all. Yes, and for others who are interested in participating, but the emphasis on survivors and survivor experience and the affirmation of that experience is unmistakable in the Commission's work. But it also sees itself as challenging the dominant narrative of the history of the state. It sees itself as rewriting history, as providing another kind of perspective on how Canada was formed, and another perspective on the harms of the state, the systemic human rights violations that are at the basis of the Indian residential schools. Those two goals, in my experience as an anthropologist doing research on the TRC, come into conflict because the dominant themes of harm in the schools in the Commissioner's sharing circle, at least those aspects that I've seen that are prominent in the public spectacle of the Commission, come into conflict with the variety of narratives that are necessary to create a historical picture of the schools, of how they came into being, and what are the durable consequences. One of the things that survivors often do in their testimony is interrupt themselves or stop the narrative and go on to something else. And the phenomenon that I refer to is, while I have the microphone, so they'll give their testimony, they'll stop it and they'll say, while I have the microphone, and they'll go on from there. And what they talk about when they have the microphone, and they're not interrupted, it's an affirmative experience, so they are allowed to go on. And the narrative of what troubles them in the present is tremendously variable. It will have to do with the fostering of children today, their removal from families, foster care being a major phenomenon, that some people see direct analogies with the Indian residential schools. It'll be about the Indian Act. It'll be about treaties. It'll be about racism in the workplace. It'll be about missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Idle no more. It'll be about the cost of the food in the cafeteria, which they can't afford. They've come down there all that way, and it's too expensive for them to eat. It seems trivial, but it's whatever is on people's minds. Unwanted arrests, the number of Aboriginal people incarcerated, on and on. And what seems to be, what this seems to tell us about the experience of trauma, about the narration of the past, is that that understanding of one's personal experience is being reported through the lens of ongoing grievance, of ongoing injustice. And it is this experience that is a part of what we're seeing in the narration of memory. It is the creation of a category of belonging that's based on names contained in school registries. 138 schools, in fact. And only those names, those are the ones who are truly the survivors, in which the Commission has a mandate to report about. And so it's extended to include key markers of experience. Survivors construct a sense of supportive belonging, again as an outcome of affirmation of the mandate of the Commission. But what this does is create an ontological niche that is protected from, actively defending itself against competing opinions. A solitude, in the sense of an understanding of oneself as a social and legal entity that is separate from mainstream society, from a dominant society. And so the sense of injustice that is at the basis of the Truth Commission and the narration of experience is more than a symptom of the accumulation of grievances. It's a foundation for group membership. It's a way that people see themselves as belonging, a source of identity, a new source of identity, personal identity and a group identity. And that is also a part of the Commission's work, a consequence of how it begins and the powers that it has, the limited powers that it has. I'll end it there and leave, hopefully, if left time for your questions and comments. Thank you very much.